Imagine this. It's March 19, 1945, and Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan stands on the listing flight deck of USS Franklin, 50 miles off the coast of Japan, watching his ship burn with flames so intense they're melting steel plating, and he's asking himself a question that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Do we save the ship, or do we save ourselves? Around him, the bodies of 724 sailors lie scattered across a carrier that just minutes ago was the pride of Task Force 58, a floating city of 2,600 men and nearly 100 aircraft that represented American industrial might and naval supremacy. But now she's something else entirely. She's a floating tomb that every officer and sailor knows should be sinking, that by every calculation of naval architecture and damage control should already be beneath the waves. Yet somehow she's still afloat. Listing 13 degrees to starboard, her forward section a crater of twisted metal, where 2 Japanese bombs penetrated her flight deck at 7:07 a.m. and detonated in the hangar bay among fully fueled and armed aircraft, triggering a cascade of explosions that turned her into what witnesses would describe as a floating volcano. O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, isn't supposed to be making tactical decisions. His job is to comfort the dying and pray for the dead. But in the chaos of those first minutes after the attack, when the captain is unconscious, when half the officers are dead or wounded, when fires are cooking off ammunition in magazines that could blow the ship into pieces smaller than a man's fist, he finds himself organizing firefighting parties, leading men back into infernos to rescue trapped sailors, making life and death choices about which fires to fight and which compartments to abandon. And the twisted irony isn't lost on him that a man of God is deciding who lives and who dies based on cold calculations of survival probability. The statistics that morning were catastrophic beyond anything the US Navy had experienced on a single ship. 724 dead, 265 wounded, over half the crew casualties in the span of 6 minutes, the worst losses on any American warship that didn't sink, worse than Pearl Harbor's Arizona in terms of raw numbers of dead, worse than any kamikaze strike, worse than anything except the ships that went down with all hands. And what made it worse was that most of those 724 men didn't die from the initial bombs, but from the fires, from the cook-offs, from being trapped in compartments that became ovens, from jumping overboard into the Pacific to escape the flames, only to be run over by escorts or to drift away and drown in the 1,000 miles of empty ocean. Within 2 hours of the attack, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carrier task force from USS Bunker Hill, sent a signal to escort cruiser USS Pittsburgh with orders that everyone who saw them understood. Prepare to take Franklin under tow or sink her if necessary. She cannot be saved in her current state. The assumption was universal. Franklin was finished, a total loss, and the only question was whether to scuttle her immediately to prevent her from being captured or used as propaganda by the Japanese, or to attempt a tow back to Ulithi, knowing that either way she'd never fight again, that her combat career was over, that she'd be stripped for parts or turned into razor blades and refrigerators once the war ended. But here's the twist that would transform naval history and create a legend that still echoes through every damage control school in every navy worldwide. A core group of 704 sailors, less than a third of her original crew, men who by all rights should have abandoned ship when given the chance, who could have transferred to rescue vessels and lived to fight another day, instead chose to stay aboard their burning, listing, exploding carrier and bring her home through 12,000 miles of ocean, through typhoons and continued Japanese air attacks, through mechanical failures and psychological breakdowns, through moments when the ship herself seemed determined to die, yet these men refused to let her go, and in doing so, they didn't just save a ship. They rewrote the rules of what was possible in naval damage control. They created a template for survival that influences naval architecture and emergency procedures to this day, and they proved something profound about human resilience and collective determination that transcends the merely technical or tactical. The question we're exploring today isn't how did USS Franklin survive? The engineering and damage control specifics are well documented. But why did those 704 men stay? What psychological and cultural factors made them choose almost certain death over reasonable evacuation? How did their decision reshape naval culture's understanding of duty and sacrifice? And what does their story tell us about the human capacity to endure when every rational calculation says surrender is the only option? To understand why Franklin's survival became legendary, we need to understand what aircraft carriers meant to American naval culture in 1945, and how that specific ship embodied both the promise and the vulnerability of carrier warfare. The Essex-class carriers, of which Franklin was the fifth built, represented the United States' industrial response to Pearl Harbor. These weren't just ships, but symbols of American manufacturing supremacy, each one containing 21 million pounds of steel, 7,400 tons of armor, propulsion systems generating 150,000 horsepower, capable of launching 100 aircraft from a flight deck covering nearly 5 acres. The construction of USS Franklin began at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, a symbolic timing that wasn't coincidental but deliberate. The keel-laying ceremony, attended by families who'd lost men on Arizona and Oklahoma, the ship's very existence, a promise that America would build its way to victory. She was christened on October 14, 1943, by Lieutenant Governor's wife, Mrs. Millard F. Caldwell, Jr., thus named after Benjamin Franklin, in keeping with the tradition of naming carriers after famous Americans and battles, and she was commissioned on January 31, 1944, under the command of Captain James M. Shoemaker, a Naval Academy graduate who'd served on battleships and cruisers but was new to carrier operations, learning his trade during Franklin's shakedown cruise in the Caribbean, where the ship's air group practiced launch and recovery operations that would soon face real combat testing in the Pacific. The crew that assembled on Franklin in early 1944 represented a cross-section of American society that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, college graduates serving as officers alongside high school dropouts working as deckhands, a mixing of classes and regions forced by the draft and by the massive expansion of the Navy from 161,000 personnel in 1940 to over 4 million by 1945, men who in peacetime would never have met suddenly living in steel compartments smaller than prison cells, sharing bunks in hot bunking arrangements where sailors on different watches slept in the same racks, eating the same food, facing the same dangers, creating bonds that veterans would later describe as closer than family, forged by proximity and shared purpose that civilian life rarely replicates. The cultural psychology of carrier crews in 1945 reflected a complex mixture of pride, fear, and fatalism that outsiders struggled to understand. Carriers were simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable ships in the fleet. They could project force across hundreds of miles through their air wings, but their massive fuel and ammunition loads made them floating bombs if penetrated. Their size made them easy targets for submarines and aircraft. Their complexity meant countless potential failure points that could cascade into catastrophe. Sailors on carriers knew the statistics. Lexington sunk at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at Santa Cruz, Princeton at Leyte Gulf. The list of carriers lost grew steadily through the war, each one taking hundreds or thousands of men down with her. This knowledge created what psychologists would now recognize as a form of anticipatory trauma, where sailors mentally prepared for catastrophe even during routine operations, developing superstitions and rituals meant to ward off disaster, carrying good luck charms from home, writing letters before combat operations that began, "If you're reading this, I'm dead," engaging in magical thinking that created illusion of control over fundamentally uncontrollable circumstances. Franklin's first combat deployment came in June 1944, when she joined Task Force 58 for strikes against the Mariana Islands, part of the massive operation to capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and establish bases from which B-29 bombers could reach Japan's home islands. The ship's air group, VF-13 with Hellcat fighters, VB-13 with Dauntless dive bombers, and VT-13 with Avenger torpedo bombers, flew their first combat missions on June 12th, attacking Japanese airfields and shore installations, and in those first operations, the crew learned lessons that would later save their lives during the March 1945 disaster. Ensign Charles Carroll, a fighter pilot fresh from training, described his first carrier landing under combat conditions as pure terror mixed with absolute concentration. You're trying to catch a wire on a moving platform while exhausted from combat and low on fuel, knowing that if you miss all wires, you either go into the barrier and probably die, or you go over the side into the ocean and definitely die, so failure literally isn't an option. You land successfully or you don't land at all. This high-stakes environment created a cultural mentality where impossible tasks became routine, where accepting death as a possible outcome of everyday operations became psychologically necessary just to function. The ship participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the famous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft while losing only 29 of their own, a victory so lopsided it effectively destroyed Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. But Franklin's crew experienced the battle differently than history books record it. Below decks, men worked in magazines passing ammunition in human chains, never seeing the sky or knowing who was winning, just feeding shells and bombs to guns and planes until their hands bled and their backs gave out, existing in a mechanized hell that reduced them to components in a larger machine. And several crew members later reported that this dehumanizing experience, this reduction of self to function, actually made combat easier psychologically because individual death became less significant when you saw yourself as a replaceable part in a vital system. After the Marianas operation, Franklin returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs and crew rest, and it was during this period that the ship's culture began to solidify around a few key personalities who would later prove crucial to her survival. Captain Leslie Gearis took command in January 1945, replacing Shoemaker, and Gearis brought a very different leadership style. He was an enlisted man who'd risen through the ranks to become an officer, rare in the Navy of that era, and he had a reputation for being a hard-ass who demanded perfection and didn't tolerate excuses, but also for being fearless and utterly committed to his ship and crew. Men either loved Gearis or hated him, with little middle ground. Some saw him as a tyrant who imposed chicken-shit discipline during wartime when flexibility should have prevailed, while others saw him as exactly the kind of commander you wanted when things went to hell. Someone who wouldn't panic, who'd make hard decisions without second-guessing, who'd fight for his ship even when everyone else said it was hopeless. Lieutenant Commander O'Callaghan, the chaplain, represented another archetype, the warrior priest who saw no contradiction between his religious calling and combat service, who believed that God's work included saving lives in battle, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on March 19th, becoming the first chaplain in naval history to receive that decoration, but who never sought recognition, who saw himself simply as doing his duty as both priest and sailor. The crew's demographics and backgrounds shaped how they'd respond to crisis in ways that conventional military analysis often overlooks. Many of Franklin's sailors were barely adults, 17, 18, 19 years old, boys who'd joined the Navy straight out of high school or even before graduation, who'd never been away from home before boot camp, who'd learned about death and duty and fear in the crucible of combat rather than from philosophy books or religious instruction. Their youth made them simultaneously more vulnerable to trauma and more resilient in the face of it, because they hadn't yet developed the life experience to fully comprehend their own mortality, hadn't yet accumulated the psychological baggage that makes older men cautious and risk-averse. Ship's cook third-class Robert Blanchard, who was 19 during the March attack, later said in an oral history interview that, "We didn't think we were going to die because we couldn't really imagine it. Death was something that happened to other people, to the guys in the photos we saw in Life magazine, not to us. And that ignorance or denial or whatever you want to call it made us braver than we had any right to be, because we do things that any sane person with a fully developed sense of mortality would never attempt." The technological complexity of Essex-class carriers meant that crew specialization was extreme. A sailor might spend his entire deployment working in one compartment doing one job, never seeing most of the ship, never meeting most of the crew, creating isolated communities within the larger vessel that had their own cultures, hierarchies, and social dynamics. Aviation mechanics who maintained aircraft in the hangar bay had different experiences and perspectives than fire control technicians who worked in the island's superstructure, who were different from the black gang working in the engine rooms, who were different from the deck crew who handled aircraft on the flight deck during launch and recovery operations. This fragmentation meant that when disaster struck, crew response wasn't unified but instead reflected the specific cultures of different compartments and departments, some of which responded with disciplined efficiency while others dissolved into chaos, creating a mosaic of reactions that ranged from heroic to cowardly, from brilliantly improvised to fatally bungled. Franklin's road to the March 19, 1945 disaster began in October 1944, when she returned to the Pacific for operations supporting the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines, strikes that put her in range of the newly emerged kamikaze threat that would dominate the last year of the Pacific War and fundamentally change naval warfare psychology. On October 13th, a Japanese aircraft crashed into Franklin's flight deck near the aft elevator, the impact killing 56 men and wounding 60 more, fires spreading through the hangar bay requiring hours to control, the ship forced to withdraw to Ulithi for repairs that took 2 weeks. And this attack should have served as a warning about the ship's vulnerability to catastrophic damage from relatively small attacks. But instead, it created false confidence. The crew had faced fire and explosion, had contained the damage, had saved the ship. And this success made them believe they were invulnerable, that they could handle whatever the Japanese threw at them, a dangerous psychological state that damage control experts recognize as one of the leading causes of disaster because it reduces caution and vigilance. The ship returned to operations in November, participating in strikes against Luzon, and then withdrawing to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State for more extensive repairs and modifications from December 1944 through February 1945. And during this yard period, the ship received upgrades to her anti-aircraft defenses and damage control systems, but more significantly, she received a partially new crew as sailors rotated out and new replacements arrived, disrupting the social bonds and institutional knowledge that had developed over previous months. Veterans who'd been with Franklin since commissioning found themselves working alongside boots who didn't know the ship's layout, who hadn't internalized the emergency procedures, who didn't have the muscle memory that lets damage control parties respond to fires and floods without thinking, and this dilution of experience created vulnerability that wouldn't become apparent until crisis struck. When Franklin sortied from Ulithi on March 14, 1945, to join Task Force 58 for strikes against the Japanese home islands in support of the Okinawa invasion, she carried an air group that was itself experiencing transition, experienced pilots who'd survived previous deployments mixed with replacements who had training but no combat experience, creating a skill gradient that meant combat effectiveness varied wildly from one flight to the next. The plan called for Franklin and other carriers to launch strikes against airfields on Kyushu and Shikoku to prevent Japanese aircraft from interfering with the Okinawa landings scheduled for April 1st, essentially using the carriers as floating air bases positioned dangerously close to Japan's home islands, well within range of land-based Japanese aircraft, and consequently more vulnerable than they'd been during previous operations farther south. On March 18th, Franklin's air group flew strikes against targets around Kagoshima, and it was during recovery operations that afternoon that one of the ship's Corsair fighters crashed on landing, the pilot killed, the aircraft pushed overboard, a routine accident that barely registered in crew consciousness, because such losses were common, expected, part of the statistical cost of carrier operations. Yet this crash would later be seen as an omen, a warning that March 19th would bring something far worse. That night, Franklin maneuvered to launch position for the next day's strikes, the ship's Combat Information Center tracking Japanese aircraft movements, radar operators noting increased activity over Kyushu, intelligence suggesting that the Japanese were aware of the carrier task force's presence and were preparing a response. But there was no indication of what form that response would take. No warning that would let the crew prepare psychologically for what dawn would bring. At 7 a.m. on March 19th, Franklin was at flight quarters, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled for the first strike of the day, 31 bombers loaded with bombs and rockets, 16 fighters with full ammunition, all positioned on the flight deck and in the hangar bay below, roughly 50,000 pounds of ordnance and 35,000 gallons of aviation gasoline concentrated in the forward section of the ship, creating an explosive potential equivalent to a small ship magazine, and this was standard procedure, necessary to conduct flight operations, but it meant that the ship was at her most vulnerable, that a single penetrating hit could trigger catastrophe. The attack came with almost no warning. A single Japanese Judy dive bomber, either launched from Kyushu or possibly a survivor from previous strikes who'd been orbiting waiting for opportunity, diving out of cloud cover at 0707 hours, evading anti-aircraft fire from Franklin and her escorts, releasing two 250-kilogram semi-armor piercing bombs from low altitude that struck Franklin's flight deck near the centerline, penetrating through to the hangar bay where the bombs detonated among the parked, fueled and armed aircraft. What happened in the next 6 minutes would be studied by naval historians and damage control experts for decades as an example of how quickly a combat-effective warship can become a burning hulk when multiple failure modes cascade. The bomb detonations triggered sympathetic explosions among the armed aircraft, 250-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and machine gun ammunition cooking off in the fires, each explosion spreading flames to more aircraft, more fuel, more ordnance in a chain reaction that within 3 minutes had turned the forward third of the ship into an inferno. The flight deck itself, constructed of 3-inch steel plate buckled and warped from the heat, actually glowing red in some sections, creating a surreal landscape where steel behaved like taffy, where ladders melted, where paint vaporized, releasing toxic fumes that killed men who'd survived the initial blasts. Below in the hangar bay, the enclosed space acted like a blast furnace, temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum aircraft into pools of molten metal, hot enough that men's bodies didn't burn so much as vaporize, leaving nothing but ash and dental fragments for later identification. The human experience of those first minutes defies comprehension for anyone who hasn't experienced it. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary, the ship's electrical officer, was in his stateroom when the first bomb hit, felt the ship shudder, grabbed his emergency kit and ran toward his damage control station. And by the time he reached the passageway leading to the forward sections, the steel walls were already too hot to touch, the paint bubbling, men screaming from behind watertight doors that had been sealed to contain the fires, trapping them in compartments that were becoming ovens, and Gary faced the choice that would haunt him forever: open the doors and risk spreading the fire that could kill everyone, or leave those men to burn alive while their shipmates listened to their screams. He chose survival over compassion, left the doors sealed, and those men died, their death screams fading over 20 or 30 minutes as they succumbed to heat and smoke. And Gary would never forgive himself, even though every damage control manual said he made the right choice, because technical correctness offers no comfort when you've heard your friends dying and chosen not to save them. On the flight deck, men were being blown overboard by explosions, their bodies launched like ragdolls into the ocean 50 feet below, some landing in the water and swimming toward escort ships for rescue, others landing on the sponsons, the protruding gun platforms that jutted from the hull, breaking bones and bleeding out before rescue crews could reach them, and still others were blown directly onto the ship's propellers, which were still turning at 15 knots. The men pulled into the screws and chopped into pieces that bloodied the wake in Franklin's path, turning the ocean into a red foam that sharks would later find and follow. Father O'Callaghan emerged onto the flight deck from his stateroom in the island superstructure, and later described what he saw with the precise language of a trained observer. The forward flight deck for about 300 feet was torn up, buckled, and burning. Every plane on the deck was ablaze except 3 aft. There was a series of violent explosions in the hangar deck below. The ship reeled and shuddered from the explosions. Rockets were hurtling across the deck and into the island structure. Some rockets shot into the air, and others skittered along the deck like scalded cats. Bombs were exploding on the hangar deck. Explosions continued in rapid succession for more than half an hour. His description captures the chaos, but not the psychological impact. The sensory overload of trying to process visual, auditory, and tactile information when every sense screams danger, when the environment itself seems hostile and malevolent, when the ship you trusted to protect you has become your worst enemy. The human response to the catastrophe revealed both the best and worst of what people become under extreme stress, creating a spectrum of behaviors that challenges simple notions of heroism and cowardice. In the immediate aftermath of the bombs, roughly 300 sailors abandoned ship without orders, jumping overboard or climbing down ropes to lifeboats sent by escort ships. And for years these men were labeled cowards, court-martialed in some cases, shunned by veterans organizations. But contemporary psychological analysis suggests their response was neither cowardly nor irrational, but rather a legitimate survival strategy when facing overwhelming danger and unclear command structure. When the ship is exploding beneath your feet, when officers are dead or missing, when no one is giving clear orders, when every instinct screams run, choosing to leave isn't moral failure, but biological imperative. The fight-or-flight response choosing flight because fighting a ship-wide conflagration seems impossible. What's remarkable isn't that 300 men left, but that 704 stayed. That they chose to fight fires and organize damage control when rational calculations suggested the ship was doomed. And understanding why they stayed requires examining the cultural and psychological factors that override self-preservation instinct. Commander Joseph Taylor, Franklin's executive officer, stayed on the bridge even after being wounded by shrapnel, even after Captain Gares had been knocked unconscious and the ship's command structure had effectively collapsed, and Taylor began broadcasting orders over the ship's public address system, his voice cutting through the chaos with commands that gave men focus. All hands not engaged in fighting fires lay topside to the starboard side. The ship is listing to starboard, and we need weight on that side to prevent capsizing. The specificity of the order, go to the starboard side, not just a general call for help, gave men something concrete to do, transformed them from panicked individuals into members of a team with a clear mission. And this psychological shift from individual survival to collective purpose made the difference between ordered evacuation and chaotic rout. Father O'Callaghan moved through the ship, organizing firefighting parties, leading by example in ways that inspired men to follow him into situations they'd otherwise avoid. He climbed down into the forward magazine to help flood it before the stored ammunition could explode, wading through knee-deep water with explosions echoing around him, manually turning valves that should have been operated remotely, but whose controls had been destroyed. Knowing that if the magazine blew while he was inside, there wouldn't be enough of him left to bury, yet he did it anyway because someone had to, and his presence there shamed younger men into helping rather than fleeing. Aviation mechanic Robert Wassman, who'd been working in the hangar bay when the bombs hit, survived the initial blasts by diving behind a parked tractor, and when the immediate explosions subsided, he found himself surrounded by burning aircraft, dead bodies, and 2 other sailors who were frozen with shock, unable to move or respond to verbal commands, and Wassman made a choice that saved all 3 lives. He slapped both men hard across the face, shocking them out of their paralysis, then grabbed them and physically dragged them to a ladder leading topside, shouting at them to climb, following them up while explosions continued below, and all 3 made it to the flight deck where they joined firefighting parties. The 2 men Wassman saved working with focused intensity, as if trying to earn their survival through action. The contrast between those who stayed and those who left wasn't about courage in the abstract, but about immediate circumstances and relationships. Men stayed to save specific friends, to fulfill specific duties, to maintain specific identities as sailors who don't abandon ship, while those who left often did so because they were isolated, had no friends nearby, no clear duty station, no identity anchor that made staying psychologically necessary. This suggests that unit cohesion and social bonds matter more than individual character. In determining behavior under extreme stress, that we stay and fight not because we're brave, but because we can't imagine abandoning the people standing next to us. Because being seen as a coward by our peer group feels worse than dying, because our identity as members of the group matters more than our individual survival. The role of leadership in shaping group response became evident as officers and chiefs moved through the ship, imposing order on chaos. Chief Machinist's mate Robert Halley organized a party to manually operate the steering gear after electrical controls failed, keeping the ship maneuverable so she could head into the wind and slow the fire's spread. A technical task that required understanding of mechanical systems, but also required convincing, exhausted, terrified men to work in a compartment that could flood or explode at any moment, to trust that the ship could be saved when all evidence suggested otherwise. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurajka, the ship's air intelligence officer, took command of the aft damage control parties and established a systematic approach to fighting the fires, prioritizing which fires threatened critical systems like engineering or magazines, establishing water boundaries to prevent flooding from firefighting, from capsizing the ship, rotating men off the fire lines before they collapsed from heat exhaustion, simple command decisions that in calmer circumstances would be routine, but in the chaos of battle required enormous mental discipline to implement. Captain Gieris, who'd been knocked unconscious by a bomb fragment that creased his skull, regained consciousness around 0730 and immediately resumed command, and his first order was controversial but probably saved the ship. He ordered the forward magazines flooded, deliberately allowing millions of gallons of seawater to pour into the ship's lower compartments, increasing the flooding and the list but preventing a catastrophic ammunition explosion that would have broken Franklin in half. This decision reflected a damage control philosophy that prioritizes controlling the worst-case scenario, even if it makes the current situation worse, accepting certain damage to prevent total loss, and it required overriding every instinct to minimize flooding because flooding is what sinks ships. But Gieris understood that Franklin would sink from flooding slowly over hours or days, giving time for evacuation, while she'd sink from a magazine explosion instantly with all hands lost. The psychological weight of command decisions under such circumstances is difficult for civilians to understand. Every choice means some men live and others die. Every order accepted means responsibility for its consequences, and there's no time for committee deliberations or careful analysis, just instinct and training and hope that you're making the right call. By 0800, roughly an hour after the initial attack, Franklin was still afloat but in desperate condition, fires still burning forward, the flight deck a twisted ruin, the list increasing to 13 degrees starboard, speed reduced to 3 knots, dead in the water essentially, unable to launch or recover aircraft, unable to defend herself beyond point-blank anti-aircraft fire, a crippled target for any Japanese submarine or aircraft that found her. Admiral Mitcher aboard Bunker Hill watched through binoculars and reportedly told his staff, "Franklin's gone, she just doesn't know it yet." And he ordered USS Pittsburgh to prepare to take her under tow while simultaneously ordering destroyers to close and begin rescue operations, the assumption being that Franklin would be abandoned and either scuttled or left to sink on her own. But Captain Gieris had no intention of abandoning his ship, and when Pittsburgh came alongside to pass towing cables, Gieris instead requested that the cruiser position herself to starboard to act as a windbreak and help fight fires with her hoses, using the other ship's firefighting capacity to supplement Franklin's own damaged systems, and this decision to refuse tow and instead fight for the ship set the tone for everything that followed. Franklin would make it home under her own power, or she wouldn't make it at all, but she wouldn't be dragged home in defeat. The crew's morale in these hours fluctuated wildly between despair and determination. Seaman Charles Sharrer later testified that he went through maybe 10 different emotions in as many minutes, from wanting to jump overboard, to wanting to kill every Japanese person who ever lived, to wanting to just sit down and cry, to feeling like we could save the ship if we just worked hard enough. And you cycled through these feelings over and over because there was no steady state, no emotional equilibrium, just constant oscillation between hope and hopelessness. This psychological volatility is characteristic of acute trauma response, where the mind can't settle on a single interpretation of events because events keep changing, keep presenting new threats and new possibilities, and the only way to maintain function is to narrow focus to immediate tasks, to stop thinking about ultimate outcomes and just concentrate on the next 5 minutes, the next fire, the next compartment to check. The turning point in Franklin's survival came not from any single heroic act, but from the gradual accumulation of small victories that shifted collective psychology from "we're going to die" to "we might make it." Around 0900, damage control parties succeeded in extinguishing the fires in the aft section of the hangar bay, creating a safe zone where men could rest and reorganize, where medical personnel could treat wounded without fear of being burned alive. And this psychological safe space became crucial for maintaining morale because it provided proof that the fires could be beaten, that human effort could overcome what seemed like elemental forces beyond control. Lieutenant Gary's decision to descend into the flooded lower decks to restore electrical power demonstrated the kind of technical courage that saved the ship. He waded through oil-contaminated water in pitch darkness, using a flashlight to identify blown circuit breakers and damaged cables, manually rerouting power around destroyed sections to restore minimal lighting and pumping capacity, working alone because the space was too dangerous to risk multiple lives, knowing that if he slipped and his flashlight went out, he'd drown in the darkness before anyone could find him. His success in restoring partial power meant that pumps could operate to control flooding, that communications could be partially restored, that the ship had a fighting chance instead of being at the mercy of physics and luck. By 1,000 hours, the ship was making 8 knots under her own power, the engineering department having restarted boilers and turbines despite damage to feed systems and control mechanisms, and this achievement was more psychological than practical, because 8 knots wasn't enough to escape Japanese aircraft if they found her. But it meant Franklin was moving, was under her own control, rather than drifting helplessly, and this sense of agency, that the crew's actions mattered, that they could influence their fate, transformed morale in ways that can't be overstated. The fires forward continued burning through midday, fed by aviation gasoline and hydraulic fluid that couldn't be extinguished with water because petroleum fires float on water, spreading rather than being suppressed, and the damage control parties had to shift tactics, using foam and CO2 where available, and simply letting some fires burn themselves out when the fuel was consumed. Seaman Kenneth Gleason described the frustration of watching fires burn that you couldn't fight. You stand there with a hose in your hands feeling useless because you know water will just spread the fire, so you're doing nothing while the ship burns, and that impotence, that inability to act when action is your job, it eats at you psychologically in ways that being busy doesn't, because when you're fighting fires, at least you feel like you're doing something even if it's futile. But when you're standing by waiting for a fire to burn out, you have time to think about how screwed you are. The afternoon of March 19th brought new crises as the ship's list increased despite pumping efforts, indicating that flooding was still occurring somewhere in the hull, either from uncontrolled damage or from firefighting water that hadn't been properly drained, and Captain Garris made another controversial decision. He ordered counter-flooding on the port side, deliberately flooding undamaged compartments to balance the weight distribution and reduce the list, accepting that this would make the ship heavier and deeper in the water, but calculating that a relatively level ship could better fight fires and had a better chance of survival than one that might capsize. This decision was based on experience from earlier carrier losses like Princeton, which had capsized from progressive flooding and asymmetric weight distribution, and it demonstrated the value of institutional knowledge that gets transmitted through the officer corps, even when that knowledge comes from studying disasters. By 1600 hours, 9 hours after the initial attack, Franklin was still afloat, still making way, still fighting fires, and the psychological impact of this survival began to shift the narrative from "when will she sink" to "can we save her?" Admiral Mitcher, who'd written off the carrier that morning, sent a signal at 1700 reading "I believe Big Ben can be saved," using Franklin's nickname and explicitly acknowledging that the crew's efforts had changed his assessment, and this vote of confidence from higher command reinforced the crew's determination because it validated their suffering, confirmed that their choices to stay and fight weren't wasted effort, but genuine contribution to a worthwhile goal. The night of March 1920 brought different psychological challenges, as exhausted men tried to rest while remaining alert for new fires or flooding, as the darkness amplified fears of Japanese submarine attacks against a crippled ship that couldn't maneuver effectively, as the tropical heat combined with exertion and stress produced dehydration and heat exhaustion that further degraded performance. Father O'Callaghan moved through the ship, conducting abbreviated religious services for different denominations, not full masses or services, but brief prayers and blessings that provided spiritual comfort and psychological grounding. reminding men that they were more than damage control automatons, but human beings with souls and meaning beyond their immediate utility to the ship. The next several days became a test of endurance as Franklin slowly made her way away from Japanese-controlled waters towards safer anchorage at Ulithi, maintaining 8 to 12 knots, still fighting occasional fires as smoldering materials reignited, still pumping to control flooding, still treating wounded in makeshift medical facilities because the ship's actual sick bay had been destroyed in the initial fires. The crew settled into a routine of exhaustion where men worked 12 or 16-hour shifts, slept in brief naps wherever they could find space, ate cold rations because the galleys were damaged or inaccessible, and developed the 1,000-yard stare that comes from sustained stress without relief. But they kept working because stopping meant giving up. And giving up meant all their friends' deaths were meaningless. Medical personnel faced impossible triage decisions with 265 wounded and limited supplies, limited space, limited personnel. They had to decide who received treatment and who received only palliative care, essentially choosing who would live and who would die based on assessment of survival probability. And these decisions created moral injuries that many medical staff carried for the rest of their lives. The knowledge that they'd withheld treatment from men who might have survived if resources had been unlimited, that they'd played God with human lives and made choices no person should have to make. The voyage to Ulithi took 4 days, during which Franklin was vulnerable to attack, but miraculously encountered no Japanese forces, either because the Japanese assumed she'd sunk or because they'd lost track of her position in the vast Pacific. And when she finally anchored at Ulithi on March 24th, her crew could begin to process what they'd endured. But first, they had to deal with the dead. The recovery and identification of remains was gruesome work that fell to volunteer parties who went through the burned sections collecting what they could find, sometimes intact bodies that could be identified visually, sometimes partial remains that required dental records or personal effects for identification, sometimes nothing but ash and bone fragments that couldn't be individually identified and would be buried as unknowns. Seaman William Powers volunteered for one of these parties and later said that the experience changed him fundamentally. Before that, I thought I understood death, thought I'd seen death in combat, but this was different. This was our own guys I'd eaten with and played cards with, and seeing them reduced to charred meat and bone that broke something in me, made me realize that we're all just fragile meat machines that can be destroyed so easily. And that knowledge, that visceral understanding of mortality, it stays with you forever. The decision about Franklin's future became controversial as naval leadership debated whether to repair her or scrap her for parts. The damage was extensive, the cost of repairs enormous, the time required measured in months when the war might end before she could return to service, and from a purely utilitarian perspective, scrapping her made sense. But Admiral Nimitz ordered her to proceed to Pearl Harbor and then to Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs, recognizing that Franklin's survival had become symbolically important beyond her military utility, that scrapping her would feel like surrendering to the Japanese attack, that bringing her home and repairing her would demonstrate American determination and industrial capacity in ways that propaganda value exceeded tactical considerations. The journey from Ulithi to Pearl Harbor and then through the Panama Canal to Brooklyn covered roughly 12,000 miles and took several weeks, during which Franklin's reduced crew continued damage control and repair work while also beginning to process their psychological trauma. The ship stopped at Pearl Harbor for temporary repairs and to offload wounded, and it was here that the crew first encountered outsiders' reactions to their story. Sailors from other ships coming aboard to gawk at the damage, reporters asking questions about heroism and courage, photographers wanting pictures of the twisted flight deck and burned compartments. And these interactions forced Franklin's crew to articulate experiences they hadn't yet processed, to perform narratives of heroism when they felt only exhaustion and grief, to become symbols when they wanted to be simply sailors. The transit through the Panama Canal became a public event as word of Franklin's survival spread through American media. Newsreels showed the damaged carrier barely fitting through the locks. Newspapers ran stories about the crew's courage, families of the dead and wounded learned their loved ones' fates from news reports rather than official telegrams in some cases, creating confusion and additional trauma. When Franklin arrived at Brooklyn Navy Yard on April 28, 1945, she was greeted by thousands of spectators who lined the shore to witness this floating monument to American resilience, and the crew faced the surreal experience of being celebrated as heroes when they felt like survivors. When many carried guilt about the men who died or the men who abandoned ship, when the psychological wounds were still raw and bleeding, even if the physical wounds had begun to heal. The Navy's investigation into the March 19th attack and Franklin's survival produced findings that would influence carrier design and damage control doctrine for decades. The report identified multiple factors that contributed to the catastrophic damage. Having fully armed and fueled aircraft on deck during flight quarters created explosive potential that a single bomb could trigger. The hangar bay's enclosed design concentrated blast effects rather than venting them overboard. The ship's damage control systems, while adequate under normal circumstances, couldn't handle the cascade of fires and explosions that followed the initial attack. And crew training in damage control, while thorough in theory, had not prepared men for the psychological shock of massive casualties and catastrophic damage. The report recommended changes including separating arming and fueling operations when possible, redesigning hangar bays with more openings to vent explosions, improving firefighting systems with better foam and CO2 capacity, and most importantly, enhancing damage control training to include psychological preparation for catastrophic scenarios rather than just technical procedures. These recommendations shaped the Midway-class carriers then under construction and influenced all subsequent American carrier designs, making Franklin's near loss a catalyst for improvements that saved lives and ships in future conflicts. The human legacy of Franklin manifested in multiple ways that revealed the complex aftermath of trauma and survival. Of the 704 men who stayed with the ship, many received decorations including 22 Navy Crosses and hundreds of other medals, but these awards couldn't address the psychological injuries that veterans carried: survivor's guilt, PTSD before it had that name, depression, alcoholism, rage disorders, all the invisible wounds that peacetime society struggled to acknowledge or treat. Father O'Callaghan received the Medal of Honor in January 1946, and while he accepted it graciously, he privately expressed discomfort with being singled out when so many others had shown equal courage, stating in a letter to his superior that I did only what any priest would do in ministering to souls in extremity, and that sailors without religious vocation showed equal or greater courage makes my decoration feel unearned. Lieutenant Gary also received the Medal of Honor for his work in restoring power and organizing rescue efforts below decks, and his award citation specifically noted that he led rescue parties below in search of wounded and trapped personnel, repeatedly risking death from fire, explosion, and asphyxiation. But Gary himself struggled with the memory of the men he'd left to die behind sealed doors, telling interviewers decades later that he didn't feel like a hero but like a man who'd made terrible choices and happened to survive them. Captain Gaius received a Navy Cross, but his reputation remained controversial. Some crew members praised his leadership as essential to saving the ship, while others criticized him for endangering lives by refusing to abandon ship when evacuation was possible, for prioritizing the vessel over the men, for making decisions that resulted in additional casualties beyond those from the initial attack. This debate about Gaius reflects broader questions about leadership in crisis. When does determination become stubbornness? When does refusing to give up become refusing to acknowledge reality? When is the commander who won't abandon ship a hero? And when is he a fool who gets his men killed unnecessarily? The answer likely depends on outcomes. Because Franklin survived, Gaius is remembered as the captain who saved his ship. But if she'd sunk with additional casualties during the voyage home, he'd be remembered as the commander who needlessly sacrificed lives for a vessel that couldn't be saved. The Franklin Survivors Association formed in 1947 and remained active for decades, organizing reunions where veterans could share memories and support each other's struggles with reintegration into civilian life, creating a community of shared experience that helped many veterans process trauma in ways that individual therapy couldn't. because only other Franklin survivors truly understood what they'd endured. These reunions served multiple psychological functions. They validated veterans' experiences, provided social connection that combated isolation, allowed storytelling that helped construct coherent narratives from chaotic memories, and created rituals of remembrance that honored the dead while celebrating the living. Attendees at these reunions reported that talking with other survivors helped them feel less alone, less broken, less like they were crazy for still being affected by events that happened decades ago, and this peer support probably did more for veterans' mental health than any formal psychological intervention available in the 1940s and 50s. The ship herself had a brief second life after repairs were completed. Franklin was recommissioned.